There we go. I forgot about the microphone. So hopefully we'll get some sound now. Too many details setting up things in the morning. I'm not awake yet. Okay, so now we got sound. Well, 2 weeks ago we looked at Bildad's final attack, and he only spoke for 6 verses, so it wasn't a long attack. And in fact, Zophar's not even going to talk again. He only spoke twice. But 2 weeks ago, looking at Bildad, and then we looked at Job's response. I told you a lot of modern scholars believe that Bildad and Zophar did have third speeches and longer ones, and that we've mistakenly attributed them to Job. In other words, these last 5 or 6 chapters we're going over aren't all from Job. Some of them are from Bildad and Zophar, but that's not really true. It's based on a lot of assumptions. One thing is every ancient manuscript, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, says that these are from Job. It starts out the chapter, then Job said. So if you're going to believe the other side, the modern scholar side, you're going to have to say that God allowed the corruption of the manuscript and allowed some guy to write in Job's name when it wasn't there. And I don't believe that works. It is true, though, that some of the things Job says sound like very close to what the friends said. However, I'm going to show you when we reach those that they are different. They're similar but different. In other words, Job says, yeah, you guys are right, except, and then gives it a little change. So anyway, don't believe that. I don't believe it. Now, Bildad, he was the traditionalist. He said that because in the ancient times, before the flood, guys used to live 900 years or more, they were really smart. And that's probably true. They probably were really smart. But Bildad takes that to almost mean like they were gods. If they said it, it must be true. And they've got some oral traditions that have been preserved, and Bildad seems to think that you've got to believe the oral traditions. The trouble is, oral traditions aren't always kept perfectly. They can get messed up. You know how easy it is for a little piece of information to get changed in gossip. You know, on one side of the classroom, somebody says, Becky's sick, and then by the time it reaches the end of the classroom, it's Becky's on her deathbed and could die at any moment. You know, it gets embellished or changed. So we don't trust oral traditions for the most part. But at any rate, Bildad is mad at Job because he doesn't accept the oral traditions. And the oral traditions basically seem to say that the covenant of works is good, and that's true, but the covenant of works means that if you sin, God punishes you now. But if you do something good, God rewards you now. But that doesn't really work in life, and Job's been trying to show that. Well, Bildad, though, the one thing he said of interest was in verses 4 through 6 of chapter 25. How can a man be righteous before God? How can he be pure who is born from a woman? If the moon does not even shine and the stars are not pure in God's sight, how much less a man who is a maggot and the son of man who is a worm? So he's quoting Eliphaz's vision. Eliphaz had this vision at the beginning of the book. And the vision that I think was demonic said that no one can be pure before God. Not even the angels are pure before God. Well, now Bildad's adding stuff. Not only can the angels not be pure, the moon's not pure, the sun's not pure, the stars aren't pure, and people, they're just worms. And that's said nowhere else in the Bible. So when you hear preachers talking about man being worms, that's not really true. We can be wormish, wormy. We can be like worms, but we are not valued like worms. God does not look at the whole creation and say, yuck. God looks at the whole creation and says, I made that, and it was good, and I'm going to make it good again. And man's value is far above that of worms. So just don't go with Bildad on thinking of yourself as a maggot. It's similar. This is a satanic doctrine, and it's similar to what we call Platonism. Plato gets the blame for it because Plato's version of it that we have in many modern Christian churches is that substance is evil. Anything material is less than good. Only their spirit, only your soul is good. Immaterial things. Angels can be good because they're spirits, but we're polluted because we're body, we're matter. That's not true. Jesus came to earth in a body and was not impure or sinful. So there's nothing wrong with bodies. They are corrupt. They will be fixed, though. They're fixable. So then Job, he replied very harshly to Bildad, and he said, what spirit do you get your information from, Bildad? And the information, or the implication of that is, it's not from God. God doesn't say that, so you must be speaking from some kind of a wicked spirit. But then Job laid out the sovereignty of God, and he used the creation and the flood to show God's sovereignty. He also, in that passage, hints at the afterlife of the wicked. If you remember, he said that the departed souls died, but now they're trembling and fearful in hell. He called it Sheol. Now, if you die, and then you go to some place, and then you're trembling and afraid, what does that mean? It means you're not dead anymore, because dead things don't tremble and aren't afraid. So Job not only had a vision of his own resurrection from the dead, he also now has an understanding to some degree that all human life, when it dies, goes to resurrection. You're either going to be with God or you're going to be in Sheol, the underworld, as they called it. He also had some interesting we're going to get a lot more into scientific ideas because God's speech is full of scientific ideas. But Job said, God hangs the earth on nothing. Now, most ancient cultures had wacko ideas, like the earth is on the back of a giant tortoise. And someone asked the woman, well, if the earth's on the back of a giant tortoise, then what's the giant tortoise on? And she says, it's tortoises all the way down. So some kind of infinite number of tortoises holding up the universe. That's the kind of crazy stuff that a lot of ancient people believe. Job didn't. He said God hangs the earth on nothing, which sounds a lot like gravity and free spinning and all that sort of thing. Okay, now the last thing he said that was important was in verse 14 of chapter 28 or 26. These are the mere edges of God's ways. How small a whisper we hear of him, but the thunder of his power, who can understand? So Job says we hardly even touch the knowledge of God. We don't understand him. And so the last thing Job is talking about is now in chapters 27 and 28, we went over last week, is wisdom. How do you find wisdom? Hello. Come on in, plenty of places to sit. So last week we looked at Job chapters 27 and 28, and we saw, for one thing, is that Job is not entirely cured yet. Even though he's feeling better, he is not always feeling good. He has lingering anger and bitterness against God. He says, God has taken away my justice and made my soul bitter. Now, in a sense, Job isn't wrong. It's his emotional feelings. He is talking about what he feels, not what is necessarily true. This is why we try to distinguish between truth and feelings, because what you feel is not always necessarily true. Job feels that God has taken away his justice. Now, objectively, that is false, because God doesn't take away anybody's justice. God is entirely righteous all the time. So Job's friends were correct that Job was wrong about that. It doesn't mean, though, that they were right about all the other things they accused him of. So Job moves on to say, he will never speak deceitfully. And he, interestingly, applies this idea to not falsely admitting guilt. You know how many people falsely admit that they've done wrong things and they haven't done them? One example I talked about last week is politicians. You know, in the old days, when I say the old days, I mean 90s, politicians always denied that they did drugs. I never did drugs. I wouldn't do anything foolish like that. And then all of a sudden, when drugs become popular, and to show that you're a good rebel, now all the presidential, oh yeah, I used to do drugs. I used to sit back and puff my marijuana. So were you telling the truth before when you said you didn't do drugs, or are you telling the truth now? It's a lie to lie about things you did, and it's a lie to lie about things you didn't do. Either way, it's still a lie. So Job, though, is saying, I will never admit that you were right about me because I haven't done any of these things you accuse me of. We are all sinners and we all do lots of bad things and we should repent for those things. But there's no use lying about doing things you didn't do. That's just not a good thing to do. But then in chapter 28, we had a really interesting chapter. We call it the Hymn to Wisdom. And it's a lot like Proverbs 8, which was by Solomon. Those are both hymns to wisdom. They sound like songs in a way. And it's strange at first because Job is talking about mining and rocks and metallurgy. Now these are things you don't talk about too often. And even though I'm kind of interested in rocks, I don't know a lot about them. But Job talks about mining. So why would he talk about mining when he's talking about wisdom? Here's why. It's an illusion or a metaphor for the search for wisdom. Just as people go searching for gold or silver or rubies, or around here I guess you can find sapphires and such things. You will look hard for them if you want them. It's the same for wisdom. If you want wisdom, you would search for it. And he says that wisdom is more valuable than rubies, topaz, and gold. And Solomon says exactly the same thing in Proverbs chapter 8. Receive my instruction and not silver, and knowledge rather than gold. For wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things one may desire cannot be compared with her. So wisdom then is better than mining. And so he talks about all the great efforts the Egyptians used to go into the desert and use slaves. And they would dig holes and they'd mine along the side of rivers. They would divert rivers to get to the beds and find the gold and stuff. Egyptians were crazy about great stones. Well, Job is saying you guys should be crazy about looking for wisdom. That would be better even. But Job then asks, where can we find wisdom? And he says it's hidden from everyone. No humans know where to find it. No animals know where to find it. But we know where it is because God has it. And so the only place you can find wisdom is through God. Now, this is what we call personification. He's talking about wisdom as if it was a person. He uses pronouns. Where will we find her? Where can we find him? That means you're pretending that wisdom is a person. Without even knowing it, Job is probably referring to Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, who is called the wisdom of God in John chapter 1 and in Proverbs chapter 8. So when you take an abstract idea and pretend it's a human, that's personification. And in the case of wisdom, it is Jesus who is personified. In Proverbs and here in Job, wisdom is talked about the being who creates things and makes things properly, makes things in balance. If you've ever tried to build models, you'd know that it can be kind of tricky, especially if you got a shaky hand. I didn't used to have shaky hands, but I was pretty good at making models. But if you put a piece in the wrong place, the whole model doesn't work, because then you're missing that piece from the proper place, and you've got an extra piece, you don't know where to put it. So the idea is that wisdom is capable of fitting everything in exactly the right place, in exactly the right way. So Jesus, we believe, was the creator. In other words, in general, we say that God the Father planned the creation, Jesus acted out or did the creation, and the Holy Spirit beautified and enlivened the creation. So kind of like an architect making the plans, the builder doing the building, and the landscaper coming in and painting and doing all of the extra stuff like that. So in the last verse, though, of chapter 28, verse 28, he closed the chapter by saying, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." Now Job said, though, he implied that everyone knows this. And this is implied many times in the Bible. What that means is, and because we've looked, Job is the oldest book in the Bible, we believe. There were no prior direct written down revelations that said this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So what does Job mean? I believe that what he means is the creation itself shows us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, if wisdom can only be gotten from God, then you've got to try to find God to get some wisdom. Right? And if you find God and get some wisdom, what does that lead to in your life? It leads to departing from evil. Because if you believe in God, you're going to do what's right. So the whole creation, Job says, shows everyone on earth that there's a God and that he's wise and that if you obey him, you won't be wicked. So this is just something, and this is what Paul says, similar in Romans chapter 1. So basically, you need a relationship with God if you want to be wise. That's the important thing about the whole book of Job. Job is regretting that he no longer has this relationship with God. The friends are accusing him of never having had a relationship with God because it seems like he was evil. And Job's saying, oh, I wish I could have my relationship with God back. So it's all about Job and his relationship with God. So that's the end of our review. Now we're going to start with chapters 29 through 31. And we're not going to go through all 3 chapters. We might make it through 2. So we'll finish this section next week, Job's last speech. So Job chapter 29. Now these 3 chapters go together. They have a theme, you might say. And the theme is that Job is resting his case in a legal way. You see, in the days before the Mosaic Law, before we knew exactly how courts were supposed to work, if someone accused you of being evil and wanted you to be punished for that reason, and they had no proof that you did the evil, they just said that you did it, and you have no proof that you didn't do it, there was only one way the case could be solved. Basically, you go to a judge, and the judge says to the accusers, do you have any evidence that he did this? And they say, no, we don't have any evidence, but we know he did it. And then the accuser says, well, I can't prove I didn't do it, but I swear on the Most High, I swear on everything that I didn't do it. And it all comes down to who does the judge believe. If the judge believes the accused, he will be set free, and the accusers will be possibly forced to pay restitution. And if he believes the accusers, he may kill the guy. So the judge is the one ultimately responsible to decide, did he do it or didn't he do it? And it seems that in these last 3 chapters, Job has given up on trying to prove his innocence to his friends. His friends just won't believe him. No matter what he says, they say he's guilty. So now Job is going to God and saying, I can't prove that I'm innocent, but I am, and I know that you're smart enough to see it. So let me show you and declare my innocence. I will swear my innocence, and you decide. So that's why these last 3 chapters are here. They are Job resting his case. So and the 3 chapters each have a different section. The first section, chapter 29, Job explains what his life was like before the accusers came, what his life used to be like. Chapter 30 is what my life is like now and everything that I've lost. And then chapter 31 is Job swearing that he never did any of these things and asking God to decide. So Job agrees that justice would be correct. God, you feel free to crush me if it's true that I did these things. But I didn't, and I trust that you will see that. So this is how the ancients used to decide their court cases, and so Job is making this out to be a trial. He's resting his case. That's all I can say for Job. So we'll start with chapter 29, verses 1 through 6. Job further continued his discourse and said, Oh, that I were as in the months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone on my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was still with me, when my children were all around me, when my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. So in chapter 29, Job is remembering the good old days. He starts by recalling how friendly God was to him back then. His kids were alive and everything he did prospered. I did some study this week because of this chapter on the concept of nostalgia. You've heard of nostalgia, you probably know what it means. Nostalgia is an interesting psychological practice. It's when you look back with yearning for times past because you felt that they were generally good. So that's sort of when we say the good old days. You know, back when I was a kid, things were really good because, and you have a list of things that you used to like. Now, advertisers use these methods to bring back good memories you might have. You see, our memories can be triggered to remember the good old days by music or by smells or by certain sounds. That's why you play Christmas carols at Christmas at the stores, because hopefully you have good memories of Christmas and it'll make you want to buy more stuff. So advertisers use this. In stores, they'll have the little incense candles, maybe smell like pine or mistletoe or who knows what and it'll make you in a more buying mood. I read somewhere that chocolate is one of the favorite smells for women. That really gets them interested in buying stuff. So advertisers use it. But the purpose is to get your good memories going and then to use that to cause you to buy stuff. But I was surprised that a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists believe that nostalgia is generally a good thing for people because it reduces your stress levels. When you're remembering the good old days, it brings up good feelings of contentment inside. So nostalgia for things of the past can be a good thing. But for that very reason, anything that will improve your life is something that Satan would oppose. If in fact remembering good things from your past is good and makes you feel better, Satan doesn't want you to have it because he doesn't want you to feel better. Right now, politically and culturally, we're seeing a demonic view of history in which everything was evil and wicked and racist and sexist and unjust. So the media conglomerates are nothing but devilish pawns right now. By focusing on every negative event and ignoring every good event, they try to cause the moods of those who are watching to be afraid and darkened. And the darker we become and the more afraid we become, the more prone we are to violence and partisanship. So by lying and pretending that everything in the past was bad, then you can demand huge changes to our country to try to make things good again. And this is now a tactic to discredit our government and our national history so that we can have a new political power take charge. And you do that by exaggerating every evil, hiding every good, and when the people all think that the world is doomed, then you can propose crazy stuff that'll fix everything, and you'll believe it because you want anything to give you hope. Well, that's the kind of place that Job was in personally, in the depths of total negativity. Now, though, he's getting better, and he's remembering some of the good times. And he hopes to return there. But you can see from this speech, he's still only halfway there. He's not completely healed yet. So now let's continue to the next verses. I don't have the numbers written down, so let's see what they are. When I went out by the gate to the city. Verse 7. When I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. The princes refrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth. The voice of nobles was hushed. Their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. If you remember at the beginning of the book of Job, he was called the greatest man of the East. Everyone respected him. When was the last time that you can think of, this is a question for you to think about, when was the last time you can remember a public figure who commanded respect? Can you think of anyone now who people respect? I can't think of anybody. I mean, some people, I guess, respect that Dr. Fauci guy who they think is telling them the truth about the virus. But I don't know if even that's respect. There's a little bit, maybe. You see, today is the day of disrespect. No one is allowed to be a hero because if you have a hero, that means that you compare unfavorably to a hero, and you have to admit you're just a peon. And no one wants to admit that they're just a peon, therefore there can be no heroes. We are all equally bad or all equally good. This is one reason that they want to bring down statues. The wicked hate statues because that implies that some people are better than you. And no one wants to admit that anyone was ever better than you, so you can't have a statue. But Job, on the other hand, he had respect. He was rich and he was wise and he was generous. I guess there are a couple figures I can think of in recent history who had some respect. Not today. They're dead. You almost have to be dead to get any respect anymore. Billy Graham, he had some respect. And Mother Teresa, she had some respect. And Gandhi, there's a few people who got respect this century, but not very many. So now we go to verses 11 through 17. When the ear heard, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw, then it approved me, because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless and the one who had no helper. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe or a turban. I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was a father of the poor. I searched out the case that I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. So here is why Job was respected. He delivered the poor and the fatherless and the perishing. He helped the widows. He assisted the blind and the lame and the poor. He worked for justice in legal cases. Job crushed wicked oppressors and saved victims. So this is why Job was respected in the East. And this is why his three friends used to be his friends, because he was righteous and just, and he was beloved for his social justice. But you see, he provided real justice, not the fake justice that you get from mobs of malcontents and anarchists. So that's why Job was respected in his day. Now look at verses 18 to 20. This is Job 29, verses 18 through 20. Then I said, I shall die in my nest, and multiply my days like sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. This is Job talking about the dreams or the hopes that he had for his life when he was prospering. So this is what he used to think long ago. Some commentators and pastors use this against Job. They say that this proves that Job was overconfident and arrogant in his younger years, and so he deserved what he got from the devil because he expected God to give him good stuff. That's not correct. I would say that what Job is saying here is not sinful, it is just naivete. He's being naive. It is not sinful presumption because Job was still early in Earth's history. There is no Bible revelation written anywhere. And from what the people knew of God, in general, God judges the wicked, flood, Cain, etc., and God rewards the righteous, Noah, etc. So in general, you could believe that. And so I don't think that Job, his feelings were evil. Only now in his trials has Job started to recognize that grace is to be found even in the covenant of works. He understood a little bit. He used to make sacrifices for his kids. That's grace. Sacrifices are grace to help save you, not from works. So he had some inkling of it, but he didn't understand it clearly. And you realize Job would be right, and Bildad and Eliphaz, these guys would be right in an orderly world. You know, in the Lord's Prayer, we ask that the Lord bring his will on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, we would really like it if God's complete control and rulership over the heavens were seen now here. Wouldn't that be great? It'd be great because we'd have a just society, and when the wicked came, God would squish them, and when the good came, God would raise them up, and that would be great. You see, that's what we call the ideal world. And so in an ideal world, Job and his friends would be right. That's what we would have. The problem is they didn't understand the depth and the power and the destructiveness of sin. If you understood just how bad and wicked and evil sin was, you'd understand why the world cannot be orderly right now and why God is not yet completely controlling everything on earth. God's system of rewards is not immediate, and his punishment is not immediate in our disorderly world. You see, one of the main purposes of this book, the book of Job, is to teach God's people that things aren't right now. There's a lot of things going wrong. Worldly wisdom and all of these philosophies we come up with, they do not line up well with our planet because we're foolish creatures and we have no understanding, and because God has purposes and plans that we can't understand. So all of the disorder that we see is not really disorder in a sense. It's all going according to the plan of God. You just can't see it because you're too dull. So am I. I don't see it either. In what way are we unable to understand God's plans? In almost any way. You and I don't understand God's plan in almost any way. Our brains are limited compared to the thoughts of God. For example, we cannot see the future as God can. He sees everything that happens, everything that's going to happen, and what could have happened if anything was different. Okay, we can't understand any of the future. How about the past? Our memories are not good enough to remember the past, even for our own things. I mean, when you think back on things, you miss some things that were there because you just didn't catch them. And your brain then forgets things over the years, so that you might remember the color she was wearing that day, but you can't remember what she said that day. So even the past we can't remember. What about the present? You do not understand the permutations of everything going on around you. It's amazing when you go to a court of law and you've got eyewitnesses come in and they say, yeah, I saw him shoot the guy. And the other says, no, he didn't shoot him, he stabbed him. No, he didn't shoot him, or stab him, he hit him with his fist. Everybody saw something different from their angle. So we don't understand the future, the past, or the present in any real way compared to God. Our brains have to work. We do have spirits in our body. However, we still have to work our spirit through our body, which means we are limited by flesh. Our brains can only hold so much information, and then they forget the rest. God doesn't ever lose any brain cells. He doesn't have a brain. He is sort of, in a sense, the brain in the world. Here's what it says in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So God basically says, you don't know anything. I mean, you know a little, but you don't know anything like I know. So certainly Job was wrong about his ideas of the future. But being wrong is not the same as being sinful. You can be wrong just on a trivial matters. For example, when I was a boy, I thought I was going to grow up to be a theoretical physicist. I suspect that when I was 8, I didn't even know what that meant exactly, but it sounded good and it looked like a cool job, so that's what I wanted to do. Well, was I sinful because I didn't become a theoretical physicist? No, it was just a passing fancy. It was not a moral issue per se. I was mistaken. Now, it is true, though, that you can be sinful if you presume upon the future. If, in fact, Job had become so emotionally attached to his plans for the future, I so much want to be this way and this way and this way, that he arranges his life to try to be that way and is willing to step on other people to reach that height, then he would certainly be wrong. But we don't have any example of that being in Job. However, there are some examples of this in the Bible. Abraham. God told Abraham, you're going to have a son and you will have offspring like the seashore. He waited 20 years and God still didn't give him a son. So what does he do? Well, maybe God planned for me to take matters into my own hands. So he takes his wife's Egyptian slave girl, young girl, and gets her pregnant and has a boy through him. And was that God's plan? No, it was a disastrous plan. It ended up with the Arabs and Israel hating each other. So that didn't work. He presumed on God's plans. Here's another example, David, King David. When he was a young boy, a teenager, he was anointed by Samuel that he would someday be the king. So what does he then do with that information? He knows he's going to be king from when he's a teenager. Well, he goes over to Saul's army and volunteers to attack Goliath single-handedly without armor, the strongest warrior. Now, God preserved him. But then Saul saw that David had this kind of crazy streak in him. And Saul started taking advantage. David, I'll let you marry my daughter if you'll go out and kill 100 Philistines for me and bring me the proof. And he'd go out and do this. He was almost killed multiple times because of his presumption. He presumed that God was going to make him king by him marrying into Saul's family. That wasn't God's plan. God's plan was to get rid of Saul. So here's another one, is Elijah. Elijah goes up on Mount Carmel, and fire comes down out of heaven, and he slays all the prophets of Baal, and he thinks that the whole country of Israel will be in revival. And instead, when he gets back to town, Jezebel sends people to assassinate him. And he runs off into the desert and he prays to die because he had false expectations that God was going to save the country when all God was going to do was judge him more. So you can have false expectations of the future that can make you do wrong things. But that doesn't seem to be what Job has done. When you think you've got the future figured out, God usually proves that you're wrong because you almost never have the future figured out. You might have a lucky guess here and there. But God has plans for you. You don't have plans for God. We got it backwards. We got things figured out because we think we know what we want. And then God says, nah, that's not what I wanted. And he makes it work for you. In fact, it's better. If God decides that your plans are bad, hopefully he will mess them up for you. Because if he doesn't, if he gives you what you think you want, it'll probably be bad. And you'll get into trouble. So Job was naive. It's the danger of wealth and prosperity that you may not be able to see dangers ahead. When you become fat and happy and everything's going good for you, it's easy to not realize that there's a tiger around the corner. You're not ready for it. So that's one of the dangers of Job's growing up, being rich and prosperous, is that he never had any experience with dangers. And so he wasn't really ready when it came. That's one of the reasons that God tested him. Now, God did not knock down Job because Job had silly ideas about the future. The disasters on Job were not punishments. God planned to gain glory by smacking down Satan. Satan claimed that humans cannot love God because God is not lovable. God says, really? I'm lovable. Let me show you Job. Job loves me. Even if you destroy him, he will still love me. So this was about smacking down Satan, not smacking down Job. God planned to help Job grow. Now, Calvinism, we're Calvinists, we say that everything God does is for his glory. That does not mean that God does nothing good for us. You see, there's a human tendency, it's called the zero-sum bias. There's a mathematical model called the zero-sum game. And this is often in economics, and it's in your brain. It's almost genetic. Wired into your brain. The most easy way to think about the zero-sum game is to think about a cake. Let's say you've got a nice chocolate cake, and there's two of you who want to eat it. You cut it in half, you can each have half, and you both have an equal amount, and hopefully you're both happy. But if one of the people wants more than half the cake, he'll cut it a little odd, and he'll get 2/3 of the cake, and you only get 1/3. And then you get mad because he got more than you did. Kids do this all the time. You got more cake than I did. I want equal piece. Now, we can also apply that idea wrongly to work, for example. Let's say that you work at a job and one of your coworkers gets called in for 2 extra hours this week. Your first thought may be, the boss likes that person better than he likes me. Or the boss is giving them more hours, that means he's going to cut my hours because we only need so much work done, and if she gets 2 hours extra, I'm going to lose 2 hours. This negativity, this idea that if someone else gets something good, you will lose something, is just deeply ingrained with us. That's the zero-sum game. But it's not necessarily true. Maybe the boss had an extra job that you've never done before that needed the 2 hours, and he's not going to cut your hours. Or maybe this job is going to get even bigger and he'll ask you to do 2 more hours. You don't know. You just assume that it's bad news. A lot of people assume that. The assumption or the saying that we use is, your loss is my gain. Or my loss or my gain is your loss. Just backwards. But it's not always true. In fact, it's often untrue. This is exactly what you're seeing in the current riots and the protests. People assume that they are poor because you are rich. They assume that you took all the goodies and that's why I don't have any goodies. Therefore, to get your goodies, they have to take them from us. This is all zero-sum game thinking. It's also possible, though, that if those rioters worked hard and stayed out of jail and stopped relying on welfare and quit assuming they're victims, they might have goodies too. So there's various ways of looking at it. One example of this is technological advancement. I remember about 50 years ago when I was a baby, youngster, there were computers in the world, but they were huge. They filled buildings. You know, they had those spinning reel-to-reel tapes and all that sort of thing. 10 years later, they were putting computers on a desk. And 10 years later, they were putting computers in your phones. So technological advancement is a proof that the zero-sum game isn't true. In just 50 years ago, only the wealthiest corporations had a computer. Now everybody in America has a computer in their phone. So it's not true that goodies only go to the rich. Now goodies, everybody here has goodies. There's another way of playing the zero-sum game, though. If you, instead of being strictly competitive, if people played together, if we cooperated, then we could all have goodies rather than just a few people. So my point, though, is not just economics. It's about God. The glory of God is not a zero-sum game. The pessimists and the skeptics and the atheists, they howl. They say that if God seeks his own glory, he thereby makes everyone under him peasant slaves, and we all have to be unhappy to make him happy. In other words, only one person gets to be happy. Only the rich guy's happy. The rest of us are all unhappy. That's not true. That's the zero-sum game thinking. The matter of fact is, God has created time and space and the universe, so that when God gets glory, you get happiness too. Almost every time the sovereignty of God works for his glory, it's not just for him to be happy, it's for you to be happy. You see, it's not him or us, it's him and us is the difference. So fools, they claim that God was wrong with Job. And the way they put it is, God crushed Job just to win a bet with Satan. Now that is silly. First problem is the way they state it is inaccurate. And the key word there is just. God crushed Job just to get glory by showing Satan to be wrong. The word just is the problem.